Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when learning wasn't just about books, chalk, and ink. It was also about surviving the daily gauntlet of humiliation, wooden tools of torment, and a teacher who might just be holding a rod longer than your arm. Welcome to the 18th century classroom. Picture it, a dim room lit by grimy windows, wooden benches too high for comfort, and rows of sleepy-eyed children with inky fingers and trembling knees. You're not here for fun. You're here for discipline and probably a good scolding. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into school, woolen stockings sagging at the ankles, and your linen shirt still damp from the morning mist. You know what's coming. You've been whispering again, maybe giggling, maybe passing a folded note about Mr. Pinchworth's enormous nose. You'd better pray he doesn't find it. But, of course, he does. And he's holding it aloft now, face twisted like he's just smelled something particularly French. Your punishment, the dunce cap. Yes, the tall, pointy one. Not a wizard's hat, not even close to fun. It's usually made of stiff paper or cloth, and sometimes, if the teacher's feeling inspired, it's got the word dunce painted right across the front in big, blotchy letters. You're marched to the front of the class, placed on a little stool, sometimes deliberately wobbly, and seated there for all to see. There's no escape. You sit under that ridiculous cone like a disgraced birthday clown, the class snickering behind their slates. This isn't about silence or timeouts. This is spectacle, public humiliation as a teaching aid. Interestingly, historians still argue whether the dunce cap was always meant to be shameful. Some say it originated with philosopher John Duns Scotus, whose followers believed pointed hats help funnel divine knowledge into the brain. Fast forward a few centuries, and somehow this wisdom cone morphed into a badge of idiocy. Talk about a PR nightmare. And the punishment wasn't just visual. You might be made to recite a lesson you'd already failed, loudly, while everyone else watched, or worse, sit in silence, knowing that everyone was silently praying not to be next. This classroom had no mercy. It ran on rules, fear, and the rhythmic thwack of birch on desks. In a way, the dunce cap became a kind of early social media post, something to go viral, except the audience was a room full of bored, ink-stained children, and the comments were just whispered insults and badly suppressed giggles. You sit there, cheeks burning, eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden floor. You try not to cry. If you do, the teacher might call attention to it. If you don't, someone else might. And yet, weirdly, the dunce cap wasn't used in every school. Some places preferred different forms of public shaming. A sign hung around the neck, "I am lazy," or "I talk in class," was just as popular. Or maybe they'd assign a humiliating chore, like sweeping the floor mid-lesson with a broom twice your height. The message was always the same step out of line, and your dignity becomes the lesson plan. Still, if there's a silver lining, it's this: at least you weren't being whipped. Yet. You shift on the stool, trying not to move too much in case the cap falls off, because if it does, that's another offense. Maybe the class moves on to a Latin lesson. Maybe they're copying out Proverbs, but you're frozen in your own little island of shame, silently calculating how many hours remain before you can trudge home. There's a myth that kids back then were somehow tougher, more obedient, but the truth, they fidgeted, they whispered. They rebelled in tiny ways, like scratching drawings into their slates or inventing rude songs about their teacher's wig. Some were terrified, some just got really good at hiding their smirks, and some, years later, remembered the dunce cap not as trauma, but as a strange rite of passage, an odd badge of childhood, like your first scraped knee, or the time you accidentally called the teacher mom Of course, not everyone agrees. Educators today debate whether these public punishments did any good at all or just sowed fear and resentment. But back in your stiff leather shoes, sitting under that tall, pointed crown of disgrace, you aren't thinking about pedagogical theory. You're just counting the minutes until someone else messes up, because the only thing better than surviving humiliation is watching someone else survive it next. The bell rings, or more accurately, an iron triangle is struck outside with a mallet, and it's time to shuffle back to your bench. Your legs are a little numb from sitting so still, and your pride is somewhere beneath the floorboards. But there's no time to reflect. Today's arithmetic lesson is about to begin, and with it comes one of the era's most feared punishments, the tally board. Now, imagine this: every student's name is written in chalk on a slate nailed to the wall. Each time you mess up whispering, slouching, getting a math problem wrong, a tally mark is scratched next to your name. At the end of the week, the child with the most tallies earns a prize. Just kidding. They earn a beating, or extra homework, or the horror of staying after school while everyone else plays in the mud. You glance nervously at the board. Your name's there, as always, and the marks are piling up like unwanted birthday cards. Some kids are experts at flying under the radar. Others, like you, are born tally magnets. You swear the teacher adds marks just for blinking too fast. What makes this punishment extra weird is how public it is. The board is visible to everyone, all the time. It's like a leaderboard, except instead of tracking your high score, it's keeping tabs on how quickly you're digging your own academic grave. Historians still argue whether tally boards were genuinely effective or just a way for teachers to outsource their discipline anxiety onto chalk. Some argue that it fostered unhealthy competition and long-term resentment. Others think it kept classrooms orderly without constant yelling. But to you, it just feels like being hunted with chalk. You try your best during the lesson. You really do. You count on your fingers under the desk, mouthing numbers like a whispering wizard. But then you freeze. You forget whether it's 6 times 7 or 7 times 6. You guess 45, and it happens. The teacher makes a slow, theatrical walk to the board, scratches the chalk with almost sensual disdain, adds a 5th tally to your already cursed name, and what's worse, your crush sees it. Some teachers took the tally system even further. They'd make the offending student write lines, "I must not interrupt," 100 times, sometimes with your left hand or backwards, or while holding your ears with your elbows crossed under your legs. Okay, maybe not that last one, but close. Still, there's a fringe theory that tally systems may have originated in monastic schools, where monks tracked spiritual offenses in a similar way like tallying sins. That might explain the almost religious reverence some teachers had for the chalk. It wasn't just discipline, it was doctrine. But tally marks weren't the only system in play. Some schools had a demerit coin. Drop it in the jar when you mess up. Hear the clink of your own failure echo through the room. And heaven help you if your jar's the fullest by Friday. The strange thing is that nobody questions this logic. You mess up, you pay the price. It's the ecosystem of the classroom. The teacher holds the stick, the chalk, and the keys to both terror and praise. And maybe, just maybe, they enjoy it a little too much. One day, you watch a fellow student get 5 marks in a single hour. He's given a warning and then a badge, not a good one, a giant placard hung from his neck, idler. He has to wear it for the rest of the day, and maybe into the next. It bangs against his chest like a scarlet letter carved in wood. You make a silent vow to stay quiet, be invisible, and never say 45 again. And still, for all this theater, there's a strange sense of order. You know your place, you know the rules. They might be weird, harsh, or borderline medieval, but they're consistent. And in a world of plagues, war, and poor dental hygiene, that counts for something. As the day ends and you shuffle home, you think about how your name looked on that slate. The chalk seemed extra thick today, the marks extra long, and maybe tomorrow you'll be a little better. Or maybe you'll sneeze at the wrong moment and end up with a 6th mark for disrupting instruction with unprovoked nasal discharge. It's a delicate dance, one part obedience, one part survival, and as the door creaks closed behind you, the tally board remains, watching, waiting, collecting chalk dust proof that childhood, at least in the 18th century, wasn't for the faint of heart. The next day arrives, and with it, a particularly dreaded sound, the slow, deliberate dragging of the punishment stool across the floorboards. You freeze mid-step. The stool is squat, lopsided, and far too small for comfort. It squeaks in protest as it's positioned in the corner of the room, everyone's least favorite spotlight. Today, it's your turn, your infraction. Laughing when someone's wig fell off during recitation. In your defense, it was funny, but humor in this schoolroom is treason. You shuffle toward the stool. It feels like a trial march. Some students look at you with sympathy, others with that smug relief that they aren't the ones being shamed today. You sit. The stool wobbles. Your knees are nearly to your chest. Your back curves like a wilted reed. And worst of all, your face is now the centerpiece of the room. This is isolationist theater. Historians still argue whether this kind of enforced public shame was meant to correct behavior or simply to break spirits into obedient compliance. There's an ongoing debate about the long-term psychological toll, but in the moment, none of that matters. You just know your legs are falling asleep and your face is hot with embarrassment. Some teachers made it worse by handing you a sign to wear during your time on the stool. Loud mouth, dunce, troublemaker. The signs were often crudely painted, like carnival props with less charm and more humiliation. Sometimes they were real hats big, floppy paper cones meant to symbolize stupidity. You can feel the weight of the classroom's gaze. It's heavier than any textbook. You're not allowed to speak while you're up there, or fidget, or even blink too suspiciously. The teacher continues the lesson as if your public display isn't happening. And that might be the worst part. The world moves on around you. You've become furniture, humiliated furniture. At one point, a classmate tries to pass you a tiny note with a poorly drawn smiley face. The teacher intercepts it, and the class gasps. But instead of punishing them, the teacher simply reads the note aloud, making the smiley face seem somehow obscene. More tally marks are added. Your supporter is now your fellow inmate. What's strange is how familiar this stool is. Everyone's been there. You all know its splinters, the way it tilts to the left, the way the paint is chipped just enough to resemble a frown if you squint. It's part of the school's ecosystem, like the creaky bell or the ink-stained maps on the wall. Fringe historians have speculated that punishment stools may have been modeled after pillories, those wooden neck and wrist traps used in town squares, a less violent but equally public form of shaming, scaled down for the classroom. There's even mention of shame stools in some German and Dutch pedagogical manuals from the late 1700s. Educational furniture apparently could be weaponized. Sometimes the stool wasn't enough. If a student seemed too comfortable, the teacher might assign a silent hour. You're not allowed to speak for the rest of the day. If you did, you'd be given a paper muzzle, literally a bit of cloth or stiff paper tied around your mouth with string, like a Halloween costume designed by someone who really hates children. The punishment stool was often followed by mandatory apologies. Stand, face the class, and deliver a speech that sounds less like a heartfelt apology and more like a bad monologue. I'm sorry I disrupted the class by laughing when James's wig fell off. It was disrespectful, and I will do better. All while James smirks and adjusts his now slightly tilted hairpiece. You make it through your sentence. Your legs tingle as you stand. The stool groans with relief. You shuffle back to your desk and pretend nothing happened. But now, when someone else is summoned to the stool, you find yourself staring a little longer. That's the cruel magic of the punishment. It turns everyone into a little bit of a voyeur. And yet, there's something oddly unifying about it, a weird sense of camaraderie, a shared experience of mutual misery. You and your classmates may fight over marbles and gossip, but you all know the feeling of that stool beneath you. Its legacy binds you in a pact of silent understanding. Later that day, during penmanship, you doodle a tiny picture of the stool in the corner of your notebook. You draw it with little angry eyebrows and fangs, as if to reclaim some power. The teacher sees it, sighs, and raises an eyebrow. But this time, no tally. Maybe they get it, too, so you write your letters in perfect cursive, each loop and stroke carefully controlled, as if balance on the page might earn you balance in life. The stool sits empty now, but its presence lingers, and you think someday, when you're old and free, you'll make a bonfire out of a stool just like it, and dance around the flames with a dunce cap on your head like a crown. You're halfway through the week, and just when you thought you were adapting to the rhythm of 18th century school life, the room darkens slightly, not from clouds, but from the slow, deliberate approach of a curious contraption, the backboard posture brace. It looks like something a corset maker and a carpenter argued over until they reached a deeply unfriendly compromise. It's introduced not with ceremony, but with a gentle throat clearing and a pointed glance from the teacher. You again, their eyes say, always slouching, and suddenly you're being strapped into a wooden framework that pins your back straight, your shoulders back, and your head slightly lifted like you're preparing to be knighted. Except instead of glory, you're granted an aching spine. Posture was no small matter in the 1700s. Straight backs were seen as reflections of a straight character, slouching that was moral decay made visible. Historians still argue whether the obsession with posture was born from Enlightenment-era aesthetics or just an easy excuse to invent more classroom torment devices. The brace creaks slightly as you try to move. No such luck. Your elbows can't rest. Your neck feels like it's been lengthened by at least 2 inches. You begin to wonder if this is how flamingos feel graceful. Sure, but deeply uncomfortable. The teacher begins to read from a heavy, leather-bound book, something about Latin verb conjugations. But you can barely focus. Your body is learning new rules. Your vertebrae seem to be plotting a revolt. At the time, these posture correctors were often handmade from wood, leather straps, and sometimes just for good measure, metal rods. Some even had chin supports to keep your gaze noble and unfaltering. You weren't just learning to write, you were learning to look dignified while doing it. You shift slightly. A squeak betrays your rebellion. The teacher glances over, not angry, just resigned, like they know you'll be back in this brace tomorrow. Meanwhile, your classmate 2 desks over has just been handed the hand tether, a long ribbon that ties their writing hand to the desk at a perfect 45-degree angle. Apparently, they were holding their quill like a barbarian. Now their elbow hovers in a position that would make a ballet instructor weep with joy. Fringe historians once speculated that these tethers were originally inspired by puppet strings designed to train students' hands à main like marionettes until the movement became instinct. It's an oddly poetic image until you remember how itchy and awkward the straps feel, especially after an hour of slow, meticulous copperplate script. And while your body is locked into position, your mind wanders. You start imagining what it might be like if today's yoga influencers time traveled into this classroom. We're starting with spinal discipline pose, they'd say, as the children weep silently into their slates. Someone in the front row sneezes. The teacher doesn't flinch but reaches wordlessly into a drawer and produces what looks like a neck yoke. For a sneeze, no, it's actually for double distraction. 2 students, chronic whisperers, are linked together via a double collar made from stiff parchment and string. They can't move without each other. If one leans too far, the other's neck yanks sideways. It's like friendship therapy by way of livestock handling. You try not to laugh, remembering what happened last time, Instead, you focus on breathing slowly, carefully, because even that's difficult with your ribs in a corset of posture-correcting wood. You imagine your spine creaking like an old ship mast. The teacher drones on about the Treaty of Utrecht. It should be interesting. Alliances, betrayal maps. But all you can think about is how your shoulder blades have fused into one large, angry wing. There's a moment of mercy, recess. You're unstrapped with the same care someone might use to disarm a bear trap. Stretching feels like being born again. Your classmates erupt outside in a burst of nervous energy. Some race for the hoop and stick. Others just spin in circles, grateful to have full control of their limbs again. You find yourself doing shoulder rolls like a 200-year-old gymnast. The brace left faint red marks across your upper arms. You try not to wince when you touch them. Your friend points at your back and says, "You look taller now." You're not sure whether to be proud or terrified. By the time you return inside, the brace is back on its hook, like a threat, like a promise. You're sitting straighter without it. Your body remembers. Historians still debate whether these physical punishments improved discipline or just made everyone quietly resentful. Some diaries suggest students became posture-obsessed adults. Others claim they slouched with glorious rebellion the moment they left school. Back at your desk, you try to regain focus. The ink flows easier now. Maybe your elevated posture really does help the blood flow to your fingers. Or maybe you're just relieved to be writing with your body unfettered, your elbows free to express themselves like dancers. The day winds down with a lecture on pen nib maintenance. You listen, but mostly you're counting the seconds until dismissal. When the bell finally rings, it's like being pardoned by the crown. You stand, slowly, stretch, breathe. The posture brace sits in the corner, waiting, always waiting. You whisper to it as you leave, "Not tomorrow. Wooden demon, not tomorrow." The next morning, your return to the classroom feels like a slow march into absurdity. The sky is gray, your shoes are damp, and your arms still ache slightly from yesterday's tangle with the posture brace. You sigh, settle at your desk, and try not to make eye contact with any hanging punishments. But of course, today's trial is something new today. You meet the dunce cap. Now, when you hear dunce cap, you might picture something mildly silly. A cone hat, maybe a word like fool, scribbled on the front in exaggerated lettering. But in the 18th century, this hat wasn't just a joke, it was a public branding, a scarlet letter for the educationally unfortunate. The teacher doesn't announce it. They just place the hat gently on the head of a student who's answered a question incorrectly twice. It sits there, tall and wobbly, casting a long shadow of shame across the child's slate. The room goes still. You feel it in your stomach. That weird, crawling, secondhand embarrassment. The cap itself is rough paper, sometimes cloth, and usually adorned with not just mocking words, but sometimes poorly drawn symbols. A snail for slowness, a turtle for laziness, a question mark that practically screams, "Why are you like this?" Historians still argue whether the dunce cap was originally intended as a magical thinking device. No, seriously. Some claim it had roots in the teachings of John Duns Scotus, who believed cone shapes helped funnel knowledge into the brain. Others believe it was always pure humiliation, with the only magic being the curse of embarrassment. Either way, when you see it placed on someone's head, your first instinct isn't to laugh. It's to pretend you didn't notice. Because today, it's them. Tomorrow could be you. The teacher doesn't stop there. The student wearing the cap is escorted to a stool in the corner, the seat of reflection, which sounds philosophical, but mostly means face the wall while everyone forgets you exist, or pretends to. You try not to stare, you really do, but the cone bobs slightly as the student breathes, and it's impossible not to glance. There's something so absurd and vulnerable about it, like watching a goose try to take a math test. The teacher begins reciting multiplication tables. You cling to them like a lifeline. 4 times 5 is 20. 5 times 5 is 25. The rhythm becomes a kind of shield. You don't want to wear the hat. No one wants the hat. But here's where things get weirder. Turns out, some schools had a rotating collection of theatrical dunce caps. One had bells attached, another featured paper donkey ears. There's even mention in fringe journals of a howling hat, a cap that required the wearer to imitate a wolf when prompted, to remind them of their wild, untrained mind. Your stomach turns a little. Was that real? Historians debate it. Some say it was exaggerated satire. Others insist it was used in smaller rural schools, passed down like a cursed relic. Either way, the idea of being made to howl on command while wearing ears feels like the exact opposite of quiet learning. And then there's the group punishment variation. Imagine 3 students are called to the front. Each is given a dunce cap, but instead of standing silently, they're told to march around the classroom in a slow, sad parade. You don't even blink. You just watch in stunned silence as they circle the desks once, twice, 3 times. Their expressions somewhere between boredom, defeat, and quiet rage. It's a parade with no music, no candy, and definitely no applause. A small part of you wonders how teachers came up with these rituals. Did they hold secret meetings? Was there a book of punishments passed from hand to hand, like a recipe collection? Try this one gets results in just 2 humiliations. As the day drags on, the dunce hat returns to its shelf. The stool remains in the corner, just slightly turned like it's waiting, watching. You think of rebellion, just for a moment. What if someone snuck in at night and painted the cap gold or filled it with flowers? But then you remember yesterday's brace and last week's hand tether and the teacher's uncanny ability to spot even the idea of mischief. Still, the thought of that cone hat stuffed with roses makes you smile for the first time all day. Outside, the rain taps softly on the windows. Inside, the classroom glows dimly from candlelight. You copy your spelling list word by word. Occasionally, your eyes flick to the shelf. The dunce cap tilts slightly, as if nodding, as if waiting. By the end of the lesson, your desk neighbor has been assigned the stool for smirking without reason. They look at you in disbelief as they shuffle forward, cone in hand, muttering something about how unfair this all is. You try to offer a look of solidarity, but the truth is, you're just relieved it wasn't you. And that's the strange part. The hat works, not because it teaches, but because it lingers. In your mind, in the corners, in the silence, you leave class with your head down, not from shame, from caution. The dunce cap, for all its absurdity, is real power. And tomorrow, it might smile right at you. The wind is colder today, and it slips through the cracks in the wooden classroom walls like an uninvited guest. Your fingers are stiff by the time you arrive, ink frozen into a reluctant syrup in the inkwell at your desk. You rub your hands together, but the real chill doesn't come from the weather. It comes from the object waiting beside the teacher's lectern, a long, narrow rod made of birchwood, sanded smooth from use. Yes, today is the day of the birch switch. You've heard stories, everyone has. The birch is legendary. Not just a stick, but a bundled instrument of instruction, punishment, and deeply questionable educational philosophy. It lies there, plain and innocent looking until it's not. The teacher lifts it with a sort of reverence, like a chef selecting a trusted knife. They don't use it right away. No, that would be too straightforward. First, they let it sit at the edge of the table where everyone can see it, a quiet threat, a symbol, and it works. Even the fidgety boy 2 seats over suddenly finds great passion in copying Latin verbs. Your mind drifts to a bizarre fact in some schools, especially in England and the American colonies. Birch rods were soaked in vinegar to purify them between uses, not sanitize, purify, as though the birch absorbed your sins through your skin. You imagine a jar of twigs sitting ominously by a fireplace, steeping like cursed tea. Historians still argue whether the birching ritual was genuinely believed to shape moral character, or whether it was just the go-to method when all other patients had run out. Either way, it wasn't just about pain, it was about rhythm, a spectacle, a performance. The unlucky recipient of the day's first strike is a tall girl who misspelled abacus, one wrong vowel, and suddenly she's standing at the front of the class, arms outstretched, palms up. The teacher doesn't raise their voice. They simply raise the birch. Thwack, a sharp sound, not loud, but crisp like snapping dry spaghetti. You flinch. Everyone does. It's impossible not to. The girl doesn't cry. She just stares straight ahead. One more thwack, then back to her seat, her hands slightly red, her shoulders stiff with silent fury. There's no ceremony, no explanation. The teacher simply places the birch back on the table, like setting down a teacup. You glance around. No one speaks. No one dares even whisper. The only sound is the scratch of quills and the occasional sniffle from someone trying not to be noticed. And then comes the twist you didn't see coming. Turns out, the birch rod isn't limited to striking palms. In particularly severe schools, especially in parts of Prussia and Scotland, it was used for the posterior application, as they like to euphemize it. Yes, over the bench, bottom up, dignity down punishments, pants intact, but the sting reportedly echoing through both fabric and ego for hours. One pamphlet you once peeked at, printed on badly folded paper at the local shop, described it as discipline through dermis, as if pain were just another classroom tool, like chalk or a chalkboard. Even more disturbing, the merit log. A few rare schools kept handwritten punishment journals where each birching was recorded in decorative calligraphy. Offense, strokes delivered, behavior afterward, like some bizarre diary of discipline, a scroll of shame. Some teachers even rated the reactions, took 3 strokes silently, then wept, resisted, required assistance from assistant tutor. It's part bureaucracy, part dark comedy, part horror novella. Historians still debate whether these logs were official record-keeping or just a way for overzealous instructors to savor their own authority. Meanwhile, in your classroom, the birch waits again. This time, the teacher holds it during the lesson, not using it, just gesturing with it like a conductor's baton, emphasizing points, drawing shapes in the air, a flourish here, a jab there. Every sweep adds pressure. It becomes clear that the birch is more psychological than physical. The real punishment is the anticipation, the sweating palms, the mental checklist you run. Did you spell everything right? Did you forget a period? Did you think about yawning? By mid-morning, no one's moved for 15 minutes. You've never seen a classroom so well behaved. It's like fear has vacuum sealed the air, and then cracks someone sneezes too loudly. You freeze. Everyone does. The teacher pauses, looks, considers, but they let it go, and for a moment, the whole room breathes again. Later, during arithmetic, the birch is finally laid to rest on the teacher's chair, a final, silent warning. You can't help but stare at it, each twig still slightly curved from past uses, a weapon that's never aimed at you, but somehow still manages to sting. On the walk home, you think about everything that happened, the smell of old wood, the way no one made eye contact with the punished girl, the awkward silence between strikes. And yet part of you wonders why birch, why not oak or willow? Apparently, birch was soft enough to bruise, but not hard enough to break skin easily. It was considered just right, which feels like the Goldilocks principle of punishment, a thought that's both ridiculous and unsettling. You pass a tree on the side of the road. It's a birch, white bark, peeling slightly. You think of the classroom again, the sting, the hush, the tiny sigh that everyone let out when the day ended. You reach home with sore shoulders and sore thoughts, because today wasn't just about rules, it was about watching someone else get broken. Just a little, and wondering when your turn might come. Tomorrow, you hear rumors of something worse, something called noseboarding. But for now, you're safe, kind of. There's a low hum in the air the next day, something between dread and boredom. You shuffle into class, already calculating your odds. Who will be the target today? What will it be for? A forgotten quill, a daydream mid-lesson. You take your seat and, sure enough, the teacher enters carrying something new, something thinner than the birch rod, longer, almost elegant, in the cruelest sense of the word. A flat, tapered wooden plank, not unlike a ruler, but it has a strange, dark curve at one end. Welcome to the world of noseboarding. Yes, noseboarding. The name itself sounds ridiculous, like some medieval winter sport, but there's no snow involved, and absolutely no fun. It begins with a whisper. The boy next to you leans over and mouths the word with an exaggerated grimace. He's heard rumors from his cousin, something about balance and shame, and then you see it. The teacher walks to the front, and with a flair that's far too theatrical for such a bleak object, they prop the plank on a wooden stool. It's about 1 meter long, painted black, with tiny notches etched along one edge. You wonder if those are measurement marks or past victim counts. The rules are simple: 1 offense, 1 session on the noseboard. The student must kneel, arms behind their back, and press the tip of their nose to a fixed point on the board surface. Stay still. Don't sneeze. Don't flinch. Do. And your time resets. Some teachers use sand timers, others simply count. The poor girl selected today had the misfortune of correcting the teacher's Latin conjugation. That was brave and fatal. As she kneels, the class goes silent. The only sound is the creaking of floorboards and her shallow breathing. You watch as her nose inches closer to the board. At first, it looks silly, like she's sniffing a mysterious plank, but soon the ridiculous gives way to something else: discomfort. Her arms are pinned behind her, her knees begin to wobble, and worst of all, the tip of her nose trembles so close to the target, but not quite there. She gets scolded, realigned, timer reset. Now it's not funny anymore. Historians still argue whether noseboarding was ever widespread or merely a fringe novelty, something used in eccentric boarding schools, possibly invented by a particularly theatrical headmaster with a flair for both humiliation and balance-based exercises. Regardless of its origin, it's clear that noseboarding was never about pain. It was about stillness, focus, endurance, a test of how long you could remain perfectly frozen while the rest of the class did their best not to stare. The teacher begins today's lecture, stepping over the kneeling girl like she's a rug. You want to listen to the lesson on Roman aqueducts, but how can you when someone is turning purple, trying not to sneeze 2 feet away? A fringe detail you once overheard at the market comes to mind. Some schools added a tiny ink dot on the board, so if your nose smudged it, you'd be caught for moving. A sneaky little gotcha. Even worse, in Bavarian rural schools, the noseboard sometimes doubled as a spelling aid. You'd be forced to recite words while maintaining position, miss a letter, and the plank got pushed closer until your nose was practically doing a handstand. The girl wavers again. The teacher stops mid-sentence, waits. She steadies. The timer ticks on, and you think how bizarre, how utterly human, that this is how punishment was once measured, not in pain, but in posture. The teacher eventually gives a nod. Time's up. The girl stands, face flushed, dignity somewhere on the floor. She returns to her seat without a word. You scribble notes furiously, have to distract yourself, have to ensure you're not next. Still, your mind wanders. How did they even come up with this idea? You imagine a teacher, frustrated with canings and scoldings, suddenly inspired by watching a dog press its nose to a treat. They muse. What if my students were forced to be this obedient and like that? An absurd form of punishment is born. Later that afternoon, as the sky turns a weak gray and the candle stubs flicker in protest. The teacher introduces a new variation, double noseboarding. Two students, side by side, both tasked with touching the same mark. If one wobbles, both start over. The buddy system from hell. That's the moment you realize this isn't just about punishment. It's about control, psychology, peer pressure. Because now, if your partner moves, you suffer. Suddenly, discipline becomes teamwork. And resentment. The poor victims chosen this time are known for whispering during reading hour. Their partnership is anything but cooperative. One has allergies, the other is furious. And once again, the teacher resumes the lesson. The human statues left to stew. By the time school ends, you're exhausted, and not just mentally. Your nose aches in sympathy. You pack your satchel, cast one last glance at the now empty noseboard, and head home in silence. Outside, the wind is softer. The birch trees sway. You spot one that looks vaguely like the punishment plank. You shake the thought away. At dinner, your older sibling laughs when you mention noseboarding. That's nothing, they say. We had the hat of shame. You don't ask. Not yet. You arrive the next day already bracing for weirdness. And the school, like it read your mind, delivers brilliantly, terribly, and with feathers. Yes, feathers. You step into the classroom and immediately notice the object resting ominously atop the teacher's desk, a wide, floppy cone made of faded yellow linen. Pinned to its rim are stiff goose feathers, poking out in all directions like a bedraggled halo. In black ink, someone has scrawled the word Simple Simon across the front in shaky block letters. You have just met the legendary hat of shame. There's a murmur through the room, a low buzz of anticipation mixed with awkwardness. Angoisse. Everyone knows what it is. Some of the older students whisper stories. It's not a dunce cap exactly, although it serves a similar purpose, but this one is clearly homemade. And worse, it smells like attic and soup. The teacher wastes no time. Today, they declare, we will address the sin of distraction. You instinctively sit straighter. That word sin adds an extra layer of gravity. You don't want to be the sinner, especially not when the punishment is so fluffy. The first target is a boy caught fiddling with his shoe strap during recitation. He barely resists. The hat is plonked onto his head with grim flair. His ears vanish beneath the rim. His eyes widen with the betrayal of it all. The feathers bob as he slouches back to his seat, and immediately the whispers begin. You don't know whether to laugh or cry, because it's funny, sure, but it's also deeply unsettling. Humiliation as instruction. The hat of shame was a favorite tool of schoolmasters across 18th century Europe, particularly in Protestant regions where public accountability was viewed as a moral corrective. It wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about branding, a visible symbol that said, this person is foolish, distracted, or insufficiently God-fearing. And sometimes, the hat came with custom labels. In more theatrical schools, students who committed specific sins wore themed hats. A whisperer might wear a cone labeled Gossip Goat, a poor speller, Letter Mule. One rural school in Wales even reportedly used a two-headed cap for students who copied each other's answers. Historians still argue whether these hats were literal or symbolic, but the sheer number of sketches and records suggests at least some variation of the practice existed. Today's Simple Simon is not enjoying the experience. The teacher doesn't mention how long the hat stays on, which is part of the horror. It might be for the whole day, or until the next victim replaces him. A second boy sneezes too loudly during Latin declensions. That's enough. The hat is lifted from Simon's head, passed ceremoniously to the new offender, and the cycle begins again. The feathers wobble. You wonder if anyone has ever been allergic to goose down. That would add another layer to the suffering. Of course, some teachers took things even further. You've heard rumors from students at the next parish over. Their school didn't just use hats. They added mirrors, small ones hung around the student's neck, so they were forced to stare at their own reflection during the punishment. A visual reinforcement of failure. You imagine that wearing a ridiculous hat, plus watching yourself wear it in real time. That's not punishment, that's psychological warfare. A fringe tidbit you once read in an old booklet claimed some teachers let other students vote on what the hat should say, like some twisted classroom democracy. Write the label yourself. The teacher would say, it must be accurate, which, of course, turned the exercise into a battle of insults and giggles. You glance over at the current hat wearer. He's trying to disappear into the desk. His feathers scrape the chalkboard behind him. The teacher doesn't even look. It's normalized. And this is the part that gets under your skin, the normalization. These punishments weren't occasional. They were daily, expected, justified in the name of discipline or godliness or character. The hat is placed on a hook for now, like a trophy. You take a breath, then accidentally drop your ink pot. It clatters to the floor, loud, obvious. The class gasps. The teacher turns, and you feel that terrible moment stretch like wet cloth being wrung slowly in the wind. But they don't reach for the hat. Not yet. Instead, you get the stare, that long, wordless gaze that says, I'm saving you, but I'm also storing this. Lucky, for now, you retrieve the pot, heart pounding like a runaway drum. The day stretches on, and the hat remains mostly still, but its presence looms, even when not worn. It changes the energy in the room. You sit straighter, you blink less, you don't fidget. No one wants to be the next Simon. Historians debate whether these punishments worked long-term. Some argue they encouraged obedience. Others say they created generations of quietly resentful adults who still flinch at feathers. One thing's for sure, they made an impact. And you, as you shuffle out of school that day, feel that weight settle on your shoulders. Not the hat, but the threat of it. The knowledge that humiliation, once applied, lingers. As you walk home under a low sky, you spot a goose waddling near the stream. Its feathers catch the light just so, and you shudder. Never trust a goose again. You return the next morning, your mind buzzing with yesterday's feathered fiasco. But the school has a fresh surprise in store, one that's less about humiliation and more about bibitimas, physical endurance. Today, you meet the dreaded broomstick punishment. No, it's not sweeping duty. That would be merciful. Instead, the teacher drags out a stiff wooden pole about 6 feet long, rough-hewn and worn from years of use. You're told it's for balance training, but your gut screams otherwise. The rule is simple and brutal. The student must hold the broomstick out in front of them, arms fully extended, parallel to the floor. No bending, no resting, just hold it like a human scarecrow. Arms frozen mid-flight. You try to imagine how long this can possibly last. 10 minutes, an hour. No one says. The teacher stands watch like a hawk, counting seconds aloud. Every twitch or slip earns a sharp reprimand. Sometimes, if the punishment is particularly harsh, a wooden ruler smacks the knuckles for slacking. You glance around. Other kids are watching with a mix of sympathy and fear, knowing their turn will come. One of the boys in the corner, red-faced and trembling, lets the broomstick sag a bit. The teacher's eyes narrow. Up they bark. The boy straightens, grimacing, muscles quivering like jelly. The scene has a weird theatricality. You imagine it as a medieval trial by ordeal, but with brooms instead of fire. Historians still argue whether the broomstick punishment was widely practiced or confined to a few strict schools. Some contemporary accounts praise it for building mental discipline and physical stamina, while others condemn it as cruel and pointless. The interesting twist, in some regions, this punishment was adapted into what's called the cane stand. Here, the student balances a long stick vertically on the palm of their hand, like a circus performer. Fail, and the cane drops, followed by more lashings. You wince, imagining that. You notice how this punishment taps into a core fear: public exposure of weakness. To falter is to invite scorn. To hold firm is to claim honor, however grudgingly. Meanwhile, the broomstick itself is a symbol of domesticity turned weapon. That everyday household tool twisted into an instrument of control. The teacher uses the punishment sparingly, but strategically. It's not about constant pain, but about teaching endurance, a mental game of wills, the kind of thing that scars silently, lingering long after the arms give out. You try it yourself, just briefly, and your arms burn like hot coals. It's a physical and mental trial. You realize why the teacher watches so closely. Sometimes the punishment is as much about willpower as the physical strain. A quirky note from an obscure diary describes a student who trained secretly to hold the broomstick longer than anyone else, becoming a legend and a secret hero among classmates. But this is not universally admired. Some scholars argue the punishment caused long-term physical damage or discouraged students altogether. You decide that, if ever confronted with such a punishment again, you'll fake an injury early on, or maybe just disappear. As the day drags on, the broomstick stands lean against the wall, silent and waiting. You wonder how many arms have suffered under its weight, and you think, with a wry smile, if only you'd known then that someday the worst you'd face was bad coffee and email overload. The next chapter of your 18th century school odyssey brings you face to face with a punishment that's as bizarre as it is humiliating: the infamous dunce cap. But before you picture a simple pointy hat, think bigger literally. The dunce cap wasn't just a cone, it was a towering symbol of shame, often adorned with a large letter D painted in bold black ink. It was placed firmly on the head of the slow or disobedient child, who then had to sit alone in the corner or on a special stool, sometimes even elevated on a small platform for the whole class to see. You try to imagine sitting there, feeling like a Christmas tree ornament nobody wants to touch. Your cheeks burn as laughter echoes around you, and the teacher's stern voice drones on about the need for improvement. Historians still argue whether the dunce cap was truly as widespread as popular culture suggests, or if it was exaggerated by satirical writings and later caricatures. Some accounts suggest it was more common in private schools or specific regions, while others believe it was a standard disciplinary tool across Europe. The psychological impact of the dunce cap is what stands out. It wasn't just about punishment, but about branding. The wearer was publicly marked as less than, a social outcast in the small ecosystem of the classroom. The idea was to shame the student into better behavior or learning, but you can't help but think it probably just made things worse. Here's a quirky tidbit: some teachers customized their dunce caps with feathers, bells, or other adornments to increase the humiliation factor. In one odd case, a diary recounts a student whose cap was fitted with a small mirror, forcing them to stare at their own shame all day long. You wonder if anyone ever rebelled by turning the tables, perhaps wearing the cap proudly, or trading it secretly like a badge of honor. After all, childhood is full of rebellious spirit, even under the harshest rules. And then there's the rumor, whispered among students, of the reverse dunce cap, a prank where the cap was worn backward to confuse the teacher and classmates alike. Whether true or not, it hints at how children found ways to cope with the cruelty. The dunce cap punishment brings up an ongoing debate among historians and psychologists. Did public humiliation in schools teach discipline effectively, or did it simply damage self-esteem and foster resentment? Modern education has largely abandoned such tactics, but the echoes remain in how we think about shame and learning. You lean back and imagine how different things might have been if the school had focused more on encouragement rather than spectacle. But for now, the dunce cap looms large in the chapter of punishments that were as theatrical as they were painful. As the day drags on in your mind's classroom, you encounter a punishment that borders on the absurd, the licking the rod. Now, before you cringe too hard, imagine being forced to actually lick the same wooden ruler or rod used for striking your palms or knuckles, a double whammy of humiliation and discomfort. This peculiar punishment wasn't just about pain, it was about degradation. The wooden rods, often rough and splintered, left a bitter taste and a raw, unpleasant feeling on the tongue. Some teachers took cruel pleasure in this, turning a simple disciplinary tool into an exercise in submission. You picture the student's face pressed close to the rod, cheeks flushed with embarrassment and maybe a bit of disgust, while classmates watch with a mix of sympathy and morbid curiosity. This was public shaming taken to a whole new sensory level. Historians still debate whether licking the rod was an official punishment widespread across schools or a harsher practice localized to certain areas or schools with notoriously strict teachers. Some accounts suggest it was more of a folk tale used to scare children into obedience than a common reality. Here's a quirky historical tidbit in some regions. The rod itself was soaked in bitter herbal infusions or even vinegar to make the taste more unpleasant, adding a layer of medicinal discipline to the punishment. In one diary entry, a student described the rod tasting like a mouthful of rotten bark, which is quite the image to hold on to when brushing your teeth tonight. You wonder about the long-term effects of this odd punishment. Would it have made the student more obedient or just more disgusted with the whole schooling experience? The debate among scholars centers on the psychological toll versus the supposed effectiveness of physical discipline. And there's an open question: did these punishments reflect broader social values about authority and obedience in the 18th century? Some historians argue that such harsh methods were designed not just to discipline children, but to reinforce societal hierarchies, teaching them to accept their place and the power structures around them. Amid this grim reflection, you can almost hear the whisper of a rebellious child daring to pretend to lick the rod while actually spitting discreetly, turning the punishment into a game of subtle defiance. Childhood resilience, after all, has always been a secret weapon. You pull away from this rough and tumble punishment and wonder how many other strange and sensory humiliations lie ahead in this long, peculiar journey through the schoolmaster's toolkit. You settle back into the story as it takes a darker, more inventive turn. Enter the dunce cap, a symbol of shame and stupidity that you probably recognize from cartoons and school legends. But in 18th century classrooms, this was no mere joke. The dunce cap was a real, physical device, a tall, conical hat made of stiff paper or cardboard, often emblazoned with the word dunce or a drawing of a donkey's ears. Picture yourself in the classroom, forced to wear this ridiculous hat, standing or sitting alone while everyone else stares. The weight of humiliation must have been crushing. Not only were you marked as slow or ignorant, but you became a living, breathing example to scare the other kids into behaving and studying harder. But here's a quirky twist. The dunce cap wasn't originally meant to shame. It actually has origins connected to a scholar named John Duns Scotus, who was considered a brilliant thinker in medieval philosophy. Somehow, his followers, the Duns men, fell out of favor, and their name became synonymous with slow-wittedness, an ironic twist of history that historians still argue over. In some schools, the punishment went beyond just wearing the cap. Children were sometimes made to stand in the corner or at the front of the room for hours, often in silence, with the cap acting as a physical barrier between them and their peers. This isolation intensified the psychological sting. Here's a fringe tidbit: some teachers added bells or rattles to the dunce cap, turning the wearer into a noisy spectacle. Imagine trying to concentrate on your lessons while jingling along as the classroom's unwanted entertainer. The dunce cap was not just about punishment, but about reinforcing the idea that failure and ignorance were shameful states. Yet, scholars debate whether this form of public humiliation helped or harmed children's learning and self-esteem in the long run. Some argue it sparked rebellion or anxiety, while others claim it motivated better effort. Interestingly, the use of the dunce cap declined toward the late 18th century as educational philosophies slowly shifted away from purely punitive measures, but for decades, it remained a dreaded icon of school discipline, a reminder of how power and shame were wielded hand in hand. As you imagine this absurd yet effective symbol of discipline, you can't help but think about modern schools and how far we've come, or maybe not so far, in balancing correction with compassion. You're almost at the finish line, but the story isn't done throwing surprises at you yet. Now, picture a classroom where punishment isn't just about humiliation or pain, but about physical restraint. Enter the infamous scholastic stocks. These weren't your typical public stocks used for criminals. These were mini wooden frames designed specifically for children, often locking their hands or feet, sometimes both, for extended periods. Imagine the awkwardness and discomfort of sitting through a lesson with your wrists trapped, unable to move or write easily. The stocks immobilized you physically, but also sent a clear message: misbehave, and you lose your freedom literally. Teachers believed that this firm grip would instill discipline and obedience. But here's the weird twist. Some scholars suggest these stocks were also used to prevent cheating during exams. You might have been the kid who couldn't sneak a peek at your neighbor's paper because your hands were locked in place. Talk about extreme anti-cheating measures. Historians still argue whether their primary function was punishment or examination control, as records aren't always clear. And here's a quirky fact for you. Some schools crafted these stocks in playful shapes, like tiny cages or animal motifs, perhaps to soften the blow or add a touch of mockery. You can imagine how humiliating it must have been to be locked up in a miniature cage shaped like a bird cage or a tiny jail. Interestingly, the use of scholastic stocks was more common in rural or less affluent schools, where teachers might not have had access to other disciplinary tools. They reflected a more authoritarian style of teaching, where physical control was king. There's also an open debate on how these restraints affected children's physical health. Some reports hint at bruised wrists, numbness, and even lasting damage. But at the time, these concerns were often ignored in favor of order. You can almost hear the creaking wood and the muffled grumbles from the students as they endured this medieval timeout, hoping to survive the school day. You're winding down now, but one last peculiar punishment awaits. Imagine a schoolroom where, instead of a cane or stocks, the teacher wielded a weapon that sounds more like a gardening tool: the flail. Yes, you heard right, a flail. A spiked ball on a chain used in medieval warfare was adapted in some places as an instrument of discipline, though not quite the full medieval flail. Smaller versions or similar-looking tools were reportedly used to swat unruly students. Now, before you start picturing knights swinging deadly weapons, historians still debate how widespread this practice really was. Some suggest it's a sensationalized tale, while others point to local accounts describing this brutal method. But here's where it gets strange. Some teachers reportedly customized these tools with padded handles or less menacing designs, aiming to intimidate rather than seriously injure. It was psychological warfare as much as physical punishment. Quirky tidbit: in one particularly odd case, a teacher was said to have used a flail-like device that doubled as a pointer during lessons. Students lived in constant fear, not just of a bad grade, but of the flail's unexpected swing when attention drifted. You might be wondering how any student could focus under that kind of pressure. It's hard to imagine today, but the line between classroom discipline and battlefield tactics was blurry in some regions. Schools weren't just places of learning, they were training grounds for obedience and toughness. Another fascinating debate among scholars revolves around whether such extreme punishments actually improved student behavior or simply instilled fear and resentment, which could hinder learning. So next time you complain about your homework or a pop quiz, remember the flail and count yourself lucky that discipline nowadays rarely involves medieval weaponry. As the school day dragged on in the 18th century, teachers often found yet more creative ways to keep their students in line, sometimes turning to punishments so odd you'd almost think they were invented by pranksters rather than disciplinarians. Take, for example, the infamous dunce's cap, a pointed hat that publicly marked a child as slow or stubborn. But did you know that in some places, the dunce's cap was paired with a stool that faced the corner, forcing the child to sit alone and silent? This was less about physical pain and more about psychological isolation, an early version of the dreaded timeout. Historians still argue whether this public shaming was an effective teaching tool or a form of cruelty that stunted children's confidence. Some evidence suggests that while the cap was meant to humiliate, it sometimes had the opposite effect, sparking rebellion or, conversely, breaking a child's spirit entirely. Here's a quirky fact: in certain schools, the dunce's cap bore inscriptions like ignoramus or idiot, but in a few rare cases, teachers decorated the cap with feathers or ribbons, turning it into a bizarre mix of punishment and parody. This strange blend of mockery and theatrics must have made for some unforgettable classroom scenes. By the late 1700s, a gradual shift was underway. Enlightenment ideas about childhood and education began to challenge these harsh methods. Some progressive teachers experimented with positive reinforcement. Although old habits died slowly, the pendulum swung back and forth between strict discipline and more humane approaches well into the next century. You might find it comforting to know that modern schools largely abandon these odd punishments, though the memory lingers in our cultural imagination, reminding us of just how far education has come. Now, as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the quiet halls of those ancient schools settling into silence. The harsh clatter of punishment tools fades away, replaced by the gentle rustle of turning pages and the soft murmur of learning. You're no longer trapped in that rigid classroom, but drifting away, far from those peculiar punishments and stern faces. The weight of history, once so sharp and jarring, now softens like a well-worn blanket wrapped around you. Feel the calm seep in, the steady rhythm of your breath matching the slow unfolding of centuries past. Rest easy, knowing that those strict times gave way to kindness and understanding, and that your own journey right here, right now, is a gentler path. Let the warmth of that thought lull you into peace, where dreams can carry you beyond time's stern grip. Soon, you'll wake refreshed, ready to face your own challenges with strength drawn from stories long told. Until then, breathe deeply, relax completely, and float softly into the night. Sweet dreams.